She moved through the house as if taking inventory of absence, small, steady steps in a place built to swallow noise. The rooms were immaculate, like exhibits, but they did not hold the warmth she had been hired to bring. There was a corner where a paper plane lay folded and dustless, as if it had been displayed on purpose rather than played with. Maria paused there, listening to the echo of her own breath and the faint, rehearsed hush that reigned in the stone mansion. If you love heartfelt stories, subscribe and stay with us until the end. The scissors slipped from Maria's fingers and hit the marble with a sound too bright for the quiet. Emma flinched at the clatter, though her face did not turn. She sat on the low ottoman in the playroom, knees drawn up, a small figure wrapped in a sweater that hung loose on her shoulders. The room around her was grand, floor-to-ceiling windows that let in a flood of pale light, shelves of toys arranged like trophies, but Emma seemed to occupy only a narrow strip of it, as if she were lit by a different, dimmer lamp. Maria had come to work that morning with her sleeves rolled and a list of things to do. Iron napkins, sweep the pantry, scrub the tea stains from the silver. She had taken jobs before that felt like balancing on the edge of survival, caregiving for an elderly neighbor, a short stint in a salon where tips were steady and the gossip was louder than the dryers. Her mother's voice had been in her head since dawn, weak as tissue. Money goes fast when the hospital gets the best of you. Maria's mother lay in a cheap room downtown, sometimes forgetting the names of grandchildren. The bills did not forget. That daily small terror had taught Maria to measure every hour she worked by the weight of what it could buy. Emma watched her with a look that was part calculation, part hopeful suspicion. When Maria crouched down, the child did not reach for her, but she did not recoil. She held a crayon like a talisman, an old wound and a new comfort pressed into one small grip. Maria noticed callus marks on Emma's fingers from where she had been gripping things too long, from gripping nothing at all. The little girl's hair, however, made Maria swallow air hard enough to make her chest ache. A crown of dull knots worn flat at the scalp, the edges of the hairline blurred by tiny sores that had scabbed and gone raw in places. Maria had seen trouble in a hair before, bad dye jobs, scalp allergies, but this was layered neglect, a mess that had been left to worsen until the hair itself had become a map of being ignored. "Sweetheart," Maria said softly, because softness had been what worked in salons and in homes where people needed time to let you close. Emma's eyes flicked to the corner where a framed photograph stood, Richard Stone and his late wife at a garden wedding, smiling toward a camera that did not know the ache that would come after. There were rumors that Stone buried himself in work after the funeral, that the company swallowed days and then years. Maria had been told in a curt briefing from Mrs. Crawford 2 days earlier that the household ran on schedules and instructions, that Mr. Stone preferred distance. She had been offered the job with a handshake and a nod to past experience, and she had accepted because her mother needed the pay. Emma did not answer, but she let Maria sit. Maria put her hand near the child's knee, palm open and non-threatening. It was a practiced gesture, how to be present without pushing, but Emma's fingers did not twitch. When Maria reached up, trying to brush the hair away from the little girl's forehead, she felt the resistance, a tightness, a weave of hair that held like an old rope. "Mrs. Crawford told me you like pancakes on Sundays," Maria offered, "because if you gave small facts first, you sometimes gathered trust. We could make them, real ones, with cinnamon. How does that sound?" Emma's mouth tilted at the thought. For a moment, the whole mansion seemed to tilt with it. The light softened, a cattle somewhere sighed. Then the smile slid away like a curtain drawn too quickly. Emma put her hand back over the knots. "You shouldn't be touching her," came a voice, sharp as a snapped twig. Mrs. Crawford stood in the doorway, exact as a carved figure, hands clasped as if in prayer, but eyes holding ice. Her uniform was immaculate. Her posture, like the house, suggested that disorder was to be corrected by orderliness, not compassion. Maria kept her hand where it was. "I was only—" "You were hired to dust and iron. You are not her mother," Mrs. Crawford said. The words were not loud, but they settled in the playroom like dust. She does not need fussing. She needs discipline. Emma flinched. The word discipline had the weight of missed birthdays and nights when lights were kept low so no one would hear that a child might be awake. Maria's jaw tightened. She could have walked away then. There was regularity in obedience she could rely on, enough money to bring her mother pain relief for another week. But the sight of those raw edges at Emma's hairline tugged at her like a hand. That night, after the household settled into its practiced quiet, dinner plates stacked not in the dishwasher, but in a way that would look untouched to a visitor, Maria found Emma sitting with a coloring book at the service table in the kitchen, overlooked, under a lamp that made the pattern of the wallpaper look like gentle waves. Mrs. Crawford passed by without a word. Maria took 2 pancakes from the warming drawer, showing Emma the little braid she had made of newspaper while she waited to warm them. It was a small kindness, the kind that, in another life, might have been a larger offering. Emma ate hungrily. The pancakes disappeared in a way that made Maria's chest both glad and furious. "You have a good appetite," she said, and beneath that a knit of worry. "Do you sleep well?" "When?" Emma's eyes went to the window where the city lights made a soft, distant constellation-scape. "I sleep with the night light," she answered finally. "It's in the study drawer. I take it sometimes." "Why in the study drawer?" "It's for important things," Emma said. Her voice was small, defiant in the way of someone who had learned how to guard what little seemed important. Maria listened, and then, because she could not be content with pancakes and hush, she asked Mrs. Crawford straightforwardly the next afternoon, while laying out linens in the nursery. "Has Emma had her head checked? Her scalp? I could—" Mrs. Crawford's lips thinned. "She is fine. Children play. Children are messy. You must not meddle, Maria. The master dislikes fussing." "The master hasn't seen her," Maria said. "Not really. He doesn't. He is a busy man. He mourns. He has duties." Maria felt her words crowding like birds behind a window. "Mourning does not excuse forgetting a child," she said, each word chosen because she knew the way Mrs. Crawford loved exactness in language when it suited her. The housekeeper lifted an eyebrow, as if the accusation were a stain to be wiped from a table. 2 days later, Maria woke before dawn. She had dreamed of her mother smiling through the hospital day room, and the memory had left her rattled and small. At 7 in the morning, she found Emma in the library, curled between 2 towering armchairs, a blanket drawn to her chin, though the room was warm. Maria sat on the floor, knees tucked, and tried again, The hairbrush this time, a soft one from the supply closet with bristles that had known other heads. The bristles met the hair and stilled. The brush caught on something like a trap. Maria breathed out slowly and examined the surface more closely. The scalp, where the hair thinned near the crown, was not smooth. It was inflamed in patches, scabbed at the edges, a few places pink and sore. Around the base of the neck she found small, moving dots that made her stomach flip. Lice, she realized, speaking the word in a paper-thin whisper to herself because words were useful in holding shock at bay. This was not the dirty neglect of a poor child. It was sustained oversight, a letting alone that had hardened into harm. Emma watched Maria but did not flinch away. "It hurts when I brush it," she said, voice muffled by the blanket. "I tried to tell." "Who did you tell?" Maria asked. "Mrs. Crawford said to stop making trouble," Emma confessed. The child's confession was not defiant. It was explanatory, like a small fact listed in a tray of items. Maria tightened her fingers for a beat, feeling the rawness of her own quick temper just under the surface. This was not about order or rules. It was about a tiny, living person whose body carried the record of being overlooked. She felt anger, not the theatrical, vengeful kind, but a sharp, purposeful heat that clarified what had to happen next. That afternoon, after she closed the silver drawer and scrubbed her hands, Maria went to the phone in the staff office and dialed the number she had kept almost out of habit, Sophia's salon. She had cut hair before she had learned the economy of avoidance, and she knew specialists who worked gently with children. Sophia answered with a professional calm that felt like a lifeline. "Sophia, it's Maria. I need help. A child, young, scalp issues. Could you come? I'll pay." Maria's words came quick but measured. She did not give the whole story at once. The salon receptionist asked for details, the kind of formality that was a thin veil over competence. "We can come after lunch," Sophia promised, adding, "Bring her to the back room. We'll be careful." When Maria went to tell Mrs. Crawford she was going to have the child seen by a specialist, the housekeeper's face closed like a book slammed shut. "You do not decide matters here," she said. "The master will decide what medical attention is required." "You cannot keep saying that the master will decide while a child suffers," Maria said softly. "This is urgent." Mrs. Crawford's hand hovered near the intercom. "I will inform the master in my own time." Maria left the room with a calm she had practiced in salon doors and hospital corridors. She did what she had learned to do when systems stalled. She created small ones of her own. She took Emma into the staff lift and up to the discreet side entrance of a nearby clinic where Sophia sometimes met clients on her lunch break. The clinic staff were brisk, kind, and used to secrets. They looked at Emma's scalp and said, in the clinical tone that held warmth under it, that they would need the child's father to sign for more than a basic consult. Maria felt the building move under her feet like a machine of doors and protocols. She called the house quietly from the clinic phone. "Mr. Stone needs to know," the receptionist said, and a clerk typed and waited. When she reached the study, she found the door closed and the lights dim. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and a cologne that had been chosen to announce presence without intimacy. Mr. Stone sat at his desk, not looking up at first. He did not look like a villain. He looked like a man who had narrowed his world until it fit his grief. When he did look at Maria, it was with the sort of polite irritation he reserved for interruptions that came without prior notice. "Mr. Stone," Maria said, and the words felt insufficient. "It's about Emma." His face changed, an imperceptible slackening that made his cheeks fall for a fraction of a second. "Is she unwell?" Maria set the clinic form on the desk, sliding it toward him like a small, urgent proof. "She has scalp infections and infestation. Sophia can detangle her hair without shaving it, if we act now. Doctors say antibiotics and dressings. They need authorization." Re-sings. "They need authorization for treatment." Whatever this day asked of her, confrontation, plea, small stubborn acts, she would meet it. She thought of her mother's pale smile and the bills that stacked like quiet accusations at home. She thought of Emma's thin voice that had said, "It hurts when I brush it," and how unbearable it would have been to return to the mansion pretending not to have heard. Mr. Stone watched as Sophia lifted a section of hair, her hands practiced and unhurried. Somewhere behind his eyes, emotion moved, uncategorized and raw. He took a breath that sounded like a man finally letting grief out in a way that made room for something else. "You're staying on," he told Mrs. Crawford later that afternoon when he returned to the mansion in a different shape, less composed, more present. "And the woman who did this," his voice broke on the word, "she will not remain." Mrs. Crawford's reaction was a pale compression. She had built her authority on the quiet administration of discipline. Now that discipline had been exposed as neglect, she had no defense that satisfied a man who suddenly measured his priorities differently. She packed with the same mechanical precision she used to fold edsheets, but there was less ceremony to it, and the house seemed to exhale as the front door clicked behind her. That evening, Maria stayed late. She sat at Emma's small bedside, stroking the child's hair with a brush made to be gentle, and together they discovered trust in a ritual no one had taught them, but both needed. Emma hummed softly as the bristles moved, the sound fragile and hopeful. Maria watched the motion of the bristles, detangling not just hair, but the memory of being unchosen. In the dim lamplight, the mansion felt less like a museum and more like a place that might one day be lived in. Outside, through the tall windows, the city lights blinked steady and indifferent. Inside, a father had taken the first clumsy step back toward his child. A housekeeper turned nanny had chosen courage over tip. A hair specialist had promised to unpick knots that were deeper than they seemed. Small acts, one after another, began to alter the architecture of neglect. Maria set the brush aside and reached for a bowl of warm water and a soft cloth. Emma watched her with the level of attention children reserve for miracles that happen slowly. "Do you like stories?" Maria asked. Emma nodded. "Good," Maria said. "I'll tell you one tomorrow, about a little bird who learned to fly again." Emma sighed, a soft sound like a pillow settling, and for the first time since Maria had arrived, her breathing seemed as if it belonged to the house. Maria thought with a fierce, quiet certainty that this small night, this kitchen pancake, this clinic visit, this decision at a desk, was the beginning of something that might be stitched back together. She would not pretend it would be easy. She knew the hair would take time to detangle. The sores would need medicine. The lice would need patience and repeated care. "Tell me about the bird," she asked after the plate had been cleared, the story offer still bright in Maria's mind. "Tomorrow," Richard said, and then, quicker than he had meant, "Want me to tell you now?" Emma's eyes widened with the practical miracle of having a father who could say yes. They tucked themselves on a low sofa in the library, the room where portraits watched their smallness. Richard's voice came slow and steady. He improvised, at times losing the thread, at times finding it. Maria sat nearby, braiding the girl's hair as she listened, her fingers gentle. The braids were uneven, but Emma beamed at her reflection, and at the man whose hands had once been suited only to contracts and meetings. The days that followed were not cinematic redemptions. There were calls about meetings Richard could not miss. There were invoices and statements that arrived like small storms. There were the awkward lunches with associates who did not yet acknowledge that their patron now appeared with a child's jacket over his arm. There were nights when Emma's sleep was stolen by nightmares, and her small body would tremble and reach blindly for the man who had not always been good at being reached for. Yet the rhythms, bath, story, pancakes, began to push everything else into a new arrangement. Maria taught Richard how to make a warm compress that soothed the sores at Emma's scalp, the cream to ease the itching, how to separate knotted hair softly rather than tug it free. She taught him to braid for comfort instead of appearance. She taught him how to assemble a small kit of medicines and wipes and soothing lavender oil, and she taught him the most necessary lesson, to be present when present mattered, even if presence came in small, interrupted measures. "People think it's all time," she said once as they prepared a bottle, "but it's not. It's moments. Make the moments count. Emma will remember that someone stayed." Richard tried to memorize the cadence of her advice. He found that showing up, even for a single swing in the small garden behind the house, altered the atmosphere of the day. Neighbors who had once written invitations now exchanged looks of curious surprise, and some offered congratulations that Richard accepted with a softness he had never used before. Not everyone was pleased. The departure of Mrs. Crawford had left its own rumor-scented trail. The chef, who had been used to exact expectations and exact wages, complained about the new domestic disorder. A housekeeper, who had long served the household's image, wrote notes about standards and reputation with a neat, invisible hand. Yet when she found Emma asleep, hair slightly damp, head resting on a throw-pillow, her complaints softened into a quiet that sounded suspiciously like pity. More serious voices existed beyond the walls. "She looks like her," Margaret said, and then, before Richard could answer, "You look like you're trying." There are sentences that do not need finishing. Margaret's words settled into the house like an additional, necessary warmth. She stayed for tea, and conversation moved in surprising directions. Childhood memories, the small mercies of neighbors, the way a town remembers those who stood for something. Margaret did not intrude. When she left, she hugged Emma and then Richard, brief and firm, like someone giving permission to a life to proceed. When evening arrived, the house hummed with a softer music. Richard washed dishes mindfully, the warm water burnishing the crockery. Maria hummed softly as she folded laundry. Emma built a fortress of cushions and declared it their new castle. Richard knelt and was appointed king without pomp. They ate dinner together, simple, imperfect, and the sound of plates became a metronome to the unspectacular work of living together. Later, after Emma was tucked under the stitched blanket from Margaret, after the lullaby whispered in the wrong words but right tone, Richard sat a long while in the library with Maria. A tray of untouched tea between them became a confessional. "I don't know if I can be everything," he said finally, the sentence making its small confession. "You will not be everything," Maria answered. "None of us are. But you can be enough for now. That is the job." She smiled, small and wry. "Also, less milk in the batter." We agreed. They both laughed, and the sound was not a cure. It was a covenant. Outside, a wind pressed at the gates. Inside, the mansion kept its lamps low. On the mantel, the smiling photograph stood in mute witness. Richard ran a finger along the silver edge, and for the first time since the house had been a museum of memories, the family portrait felt like an invitation instead of an accusation. Tomorrow would bring the clinic visit, and more forms, and perhaps resistance from those who had preferred the old order. But tonight, in the simple exchange of burned pancakes and soft blankets, a pattern had begun to stitch itself. Imperfect care, repeated. The mansion, for all its windows and portraits and long corridors, had found in its center the small domestic tasks that make people belong to one another. Maria stood to leave, the faint clink of her keys a punctuation in the room. She straightened the tablecloth, smoothing the wrinkle with a palm, as if touching lives into place. "I will be here in the morning," she said. "And the story about the bird, I'll tell it right. She'll hear how the small wings were scared, but learned to trust the wind." Richard watched her go, then turned down the light. The photograph's glass caught the lamplight and threw it in a small band across the carpet. He sat a little longer in the quiet, feeling the house settle around the new sounds. A child's soft breathing, the distant footfall of a neighbor, the whisper of someone who had chosen to remain. In the loft of that quiet, he resolved to go into the days ahead with the patience of someone learning, finally, to be present. He would miss meetings and make others. He would ask for help and accept it. He would listen to his daughter and to Maria, and slowly learn the work that would not be undone by papers or polished appearances, the work of being chosen. He stood, moved to the window, and watched the streetlights pulse like a small congregation, keeping vigil. When he left the study, he paused and picked up Emma's rabbit from the sofa. Its fur was flat from being hugged and somehow whole. He carried it to the small bed and laid it beside her, tucking the blanket gently around the animal's ears as if guarding a promise. Then he turned the lamp down and closed the door with a softness he had not known he possessed. The night held them, and the mansion held its breath in a way that suggested not an ending, but the beginning of a long, patient repair. Outside, the city continued its indifferent blinking. Inside, hands had learned different work. Love was being taught by practice and small errors, and for now, that was enough. Morning arrived like a promise kept. Maria was punctual. Her footsteps came up the drive as if she belonged to the house's new rhythm. She brought a thermos of coffee and a tin of biscuits, as if provisions were a form of prayer. Emma met her at the front door, with sleep still in the corners of her eyes, a tangle of hair against one cheek, and the rabbit pressed to her chest. "Tell it now," Emma demanded, before her feet touched the rug, as though stories had a schedule that must be obeyed. Maria smiled and stepped inside with the kind of ease that had patience woven into it. She sat on the low stool by the hearth and opened her hands as if showing something small and fragile. "Once there was a bird," she said, and her voice folded the words into the room like a quilt. It feared the wind because the wind knocked it about. One morning, another bird came and said, "There is no better teacher than the wind. You will learn," it said, "by moving." Emma's eyebrows knitted in solemn concentration. Richard, standing by the stairs in his wool coat, found himself drawn to that small audience. One child, one woman who trusted the telling of small truths to do big work. He sat on the floor across from them and for a moment let the house be nothing more than a place where people listened. By the time Maria reached the part where the bird clumsily flapped and learned, Emma had arranged the rabbit so it could be the bird. And when the story ended, she declared, with the solemnity of a child appointing a juror, "Rabbit will learn too." "Good," Maria said, "so will you." They dressed for the clinic. The car hummed down streets that were not yet awake, the muffled city leaning into its routines. Richard watched Emma study the world from the back seat, small thumb in a fixed orbit of habit. He thought of the forms he would sign and the questions he would have to answer. He thought, too, of the way a plate set on a table could become proof of belonging. He held both thoughts with equal tenderness. The clinic's waiting room was warm, a room arranged by efficient care. A woman behind the counter, one name pinned to her coat, Leela, moved through the morning with practiced kindness. A smile that was concise, hands that knew their work. The smell was antiseptic, with an undercurrent of something floral, a disinfectant trying to smell of hope. Toys were neatly arranged on a low shelf. Stickers waited for small triumphs. "Mr. Ambrose?" Leela called. Richard stood and gathered Emma close. The nurse who led them, a compact woman with laugh lines at unexpected angles, weighed Emma with the kind of patience that made numbers feel harmless. "She sleeps a lot?" the nurse asked as she took the child's height. "Sometimes too much," Richard said without thinking. The confession landed soft and honest. She's been cautious." "That can be okay," the nurse answered. "Caution is an understandable response." In the consultation room, a social worker sat where social workers often sit, with a notepad balanced on a knee and an air that suggested empathy was their job's framework. Her name was June. She introduced herself in a way that opened a small window. "I work with families to make sure children thrive. I'm here to hear from you and to help figure out what support you might need." June's questions were quiet but specific. Emma's eating, sleep patterns, who lived in the house, who could be called in an emergency. There was a section on the forms that asked not only for names, but for the tone of relationships. Richard found himself pausing at that section, searching for words that might be measured and honest. He wrote, "Maria, friend and support. Margaret, neighbor," and then hesitated, then added, "community, growing." It felt trite to render life in items, and vital to do so. June listened without a hurry that patronized. She asked how Emma reacted when strangers spoke, whether there had been visits to the dentist, routine, the scaffolding of ordinary care. Richard answered with the fidelity of a man newly apprenticed to fathering, facts and small shame. He admitted missed appointments, nights at the office that muddled into something else, a tolerance for appearances that had made up for absence. "And yet," he said, "I am here. I choose to be here." June's face softened in a way that made the room feel less clinical. "Choice is important," she said. "We can document patterns. We can also note change." When the topic turned to the house, to sleeping arrangements, and the number of occupants, June's pen moved. The mansion had been repository and museum. The idea of it as home tugged at the town's memory like a foreign thread knitted into a sweater. Richard felt simultaneously irritated and protective. He folded the paper and set it beside the photograph on the mantel as though that, too, might need supervision. Maria found him there, palms on the banister. She had spent the morning at the bakery, arranging small pastries into paper bags to deliver later. Her hair smelled faintly of butter and sugar. "Bad news?" she asked without asking. "A letter," he said. "The trust would like to speak." She put a hand on the envelope, then on the photograph. "They'll speak," she said. "You will answer. But they cannot take what you are building here. No committee has the right to that." "Not all of it," he admitted. "They might try to limit." "Then don't limit them to the old story," Maria said. "Tell them the new one. Bring proof." What proof? He felt the old habit of abstract proof, ledgers, receipts, rise like a reflex. What does one bring to say you belong? "You bring what you've already done," she said. "The forms you signed, the nurse's notes, the people who will testify that you are here. And you bring Emma. Let her be the proof." That evening, before the town had quite settled into night, Margaret returned. She did not come with ceremony. She came with a small plate covered in linen and walked in the door as if she belonged to the light. "Thought I'd leave these," she said, setting the plate down. Inside were biscuits and a loaf of something dense and sweet. She asked after Emma, and then, after a pause, asked after Richard, not as an interrogator, but as someone checking a house for loose rafters. "They will talk," she said, as if picking up a thread others had dropped. "The trust will talk. They always do. But stories do the work that letters cannot. Don't let them make this only a matter of documents." "Bring your shepherd's crook," Richard joked, poor on its feet, but honest. Margaret's smile was small. "No crook," she said, "just people. We'll come. Some of us remember that houses are for living." Their world under the mantle light had a steadying succession of small rituals. The mouse of Emma's feet on the floor, Maria filling mugs, the quiet scrap of plans being made. Richard realized the meeting with Mr. Crane would be a test, not of his right to the house, perhaps, but of the right to remake it. He felt every old portrait in the hallway like witness and judge, and he felt, too, something else, that portraits could be rethought by the living hands arranging the chairs. Before bed, he checked on Emma. The girl slept under the stitched blanket, hair a small storm across the pillow. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, watching her inhale and exhale like a tide. He had that day stood through forms and measurements and the ritual of being evaluated. He had also brought home a promise of help and a note from a neighbor who bakes on Thursdays.